to The Standard. From Vancouver, I'm Peter Klein. Tonight, a journalist who chronicled events in Iraq before the U.S. invasion in 2003 talks about a recent trip back and how the country has changed. That's a bit later, but first, cracking down on child sex tourism. Kenneth Klassen was recently convicted under Canada's child sex tourism law and sentenced to 11 years in prison. A phenomenon that seems to be turning into an epidemic, sex tourism also sadly plays a huge role in the economies of several Southeast Asian countries. Brian McConaghy is a former RCMP officer and is the founding director of the Ratanak Foundation, an organization that works to prevent child exploitation in Cambodia. Welcome.
Thank you.
You are no longer in the RCMP, but presumably you watched this Kenneth Klassen case carefully.
Yeah.
Were you happy with the sentence?
Well, I'm happy in that it's Canada's longest sentence for this kind of activity, but it still pales into comparison with the U.S. sentences, which I think are more appropriate given the number of lives devastated.
What kind of sentences in the U.S.?
In the U.S., you're dealing with hundreds of years. They do consecutive sentencing. We do concurrent, so if there's multiple counts, you serve all those multiple counts at the same time.
And one of the previous sort of high-profile cases, the Donald Baker case, you
Yes.
actually worked on, right?
That's correct.
Tell me about that case.
That was a file where it was a gentleman who was raping and torturing, actually, downtown East Side prostitutes in Vancouver. And when arrested, they discovered a whole bunch of videos. On the videos were also small Asian children. And that's where I became involved because of my background in Cambodia. They asked me to track what country these children could be in. It was my first experience watching child sex videos as well, which was horrendous. But very quickly, we determined that it was Cambodia. And then we sent an investigative team to Cambodia to execute warrants and get physical evidence that ended up resulting in his conviction. He was the first Canadian conviction for this activity.
What was his sentence?
His sentence was 10 years.
10 years. Well, without getting too graphic about this, and certainly we don't want to give people a how-to, but you know, when people like Baker or Klassen want to do this, I mean, how does someone? One question is, why do they do this, which we can talk about, obviously. But how do they, I mean, you just get on a plane and go and track girls down? I mean, how does this work?
In some societies, you can do that. You can just get on a plane and it's sufficiently open that it's very easy to interact with. And so you check into a hotel and it's not hard to find, first of all, adult prostitutes, and then very easy from there to find little ones. Mm-hmm. But also, over top of that, it's very clear that pedophiles are organized. They speak with one another. The internet communication has allowed a whole internet community to develop where they advise one another on where to go, how the kids perform, right down to individual kids, which one performs which acts best. Mm-hmm. Here's where to look for them.
And they share this information.
Absolutely, yes.
And now, I mean, you know, you worked at the RCMP, FBI, RCMP, organizations like that are quite good at monitoring terrorists. You know, if someone says we're going to plant a bomb in the CN Tower, you know, there's the NSA has Echelon. There's all sorts of ways that this can be found. Why is it that this kind of communication is not ferreted out, or is it?
Well, I think there's a tremendous motivation on the part of law enforcement agencies to catch these guys. The problem in a Canadian context is police resourcing. By definition, these are expensive investigations. They're international, they're multi-jurisdictional, and to have the resources to fully investigate means going overseas. And so we don't have the resources to do it. So basically the files that we have to work with in Canada are the ones that, for whatever reason, fall on our laps. And we actually have it to deal with, and we have evidence before us. Being proactive and going out and seeking these guys and making sure they're not doing this, or capturing them if they are doing it, and working with the victims, that's really not on the cards. In the U.S. system, they have laws very similar to us, but they have the resources to do the international investigation, so their success rate is way, way ahead of us.
Right, and I know the previous administration, the Bush administration, really said that they were going to really take this seriously and put resources into it, and it sounds like they really did.
They did. They did in a big way, and are to be admired for it in terms of their activities. Certainly in a Cambodian context, it's tremendous what the U.S. consular services and investigators do.
Well, there's a lot of things I want to talk about, but before we finish with Baker, just to give us an illustration of how much work goes into it, can you explain to us how you mentioned that with Donald Baker, the previous case that you worked with, some videos were found. What kind of police work and investigative work had to go into actually figuring out and proving that he was on those videos, he was doing it in Cambodia, and to, you know, to reach the bar of actually getting a conviction.
Well, there's a ton of work, and even with the Baker file, where that did fall in our laps, there was a ton of work. What originally happened was we had the videos. They didn't know what country. I was consulted as to what country. That starts with a review of the passport. How many potential countries do we have to work with?
Presumably the girls aren't speaking in their native languages?
The girls were speaking, and that was one of the clues when you look at the videos. The girls are speaking, but normally the children are not clothed, so there's no particular clues in terms of what they're wearing. These are not tourist videos, so there's no street scenes. There's no clues there in terms of airports or monuments or the kind of touristy things. These are all videos shot in tiny little rape cubicles. So the only thing you've got are the children, what they're saying, and the items sitting around the room. So the bar is high in terms of the requirements for investigators to nail that.
You actually shared with us a photo of one of these rape cubicles.
Yes.
I think we're going to show that in a moment. But so this is where it usually takes place, in these sort of kind of stark rooms?
Yeah. The pedophiles either go to the child brothels, or brothels that can provide children, or the children are trafficked into hotels, and so it can occur in hotel rooms as well, where the children are delivered to them. So both locations are found on the videos, and those are the two models we really work with.
Well, fortunately, there's been some attention to this issue, but I don't think most people have a sense of how widespread this is. Is it, you know, a handful of North Americans going over there and a couple dozen girls? I mean, what are the numbers we're talking about?
I don't think anybody's got a real fix on the numbers, because obviously this is clandestine activity. Guys don't advertise, but we currently have the government stats from Cambodia indicate there are 30,000 minors involved in this trade.
In Cambodia alone?
In Cambodia alone.
And there are other countries, of course.
And you take an industry that's bigger, although it's an older industry, they don't use children quite as young, but nonetheless the Thai sex industry is much bigger. So the amount of people involved in creating that industry and funding that industry is massive. We do have hundreds. The quotes I've heard recently from police in British Columbia is there's hundreds from BC alone.
Hundreds of people from British Columbia
go and make use of children and or adults in the sex trade business in Southeast Asia. So it is widespread. We don't know how many, but there's lots. And certainly, I believe that this is an extension, particularly in the child trade, this is an extension of child pornography that is growing on the internet. And we have thousands of people with child pornography on their computers. We know that in British Columbia.
Wow. Well, we have to take a break, but when we come back, I want to talk to you about what it is about certain countries that seem to attract this industry more than others. More with Brian McConaghy after this short break. I'm back with Brian McConaghy, a former RCMP officer. He's the founding director of the Ratanak Foundation, an organization working to prevent child exploitation in Cambodia. Now, Cambodia is, as far as we know, the most popular destination for child exploitation. Although there are other places, Philippines, Thailand. What is it about Cambodia in particular that has allowed this industry to exist and flourish?
I think Cambodia is a particularly good example of what goes on in this industry, in that the freedom to do this is based on the fact that the structures of society were destroyed. This is a developing country. Destroyed
during the Khmer Rouge, or?
Khmer Rouge, Killing Fields Revolution. The judiciary were executed, the police force was destroyed utterly. And it's still a country trying to get back on its feet. It does not have the resources to protect its own citizens. Corruption plays into that. Where there's a lot of poverty, there's corruption. And so that plays into this industry in terms of police being able to be bought off as well. So the children are very, very vulnerable. In addition to that, you have children and young women that look younger than they are in Southeast Asia, which is attractive to pedophiles, and children that oftentimes are considered very pretty and clear-skinned. So you put all that together along with the wealth of Western predators, and you've got a very, very dangerous mix, and that's what's occurred.
Right. And I mean, you're describing this failed state in terms of structure, but I mean also the Khmer Rouge really kind of destroyed the kind of heart and soul of this country, the
Absolutely.
moral compass.
The moral compass was destroyed. The revolution systematically dismantled families and raised the children based on brutality. And so even aside from the sex trade, the degree of domestic violence in Cambodia is absolutely off the scale. Because that's what they've been raised on.
Right.
And that environment is that almost a social anarchy is ripe to be abused by predators from the West.
You also worked on the Robert Pickton case.
Yes, I did.
This is as an outside consultant, no longer in the RCMP.
No, I was in the RCMP.
Oh, you were in the
yes.
RCMP. But most recently, have you been involved in the trial at all?
That was my last file.
That was your last file?
Yes.
What did you do with that case?
I was responsible for the forensic science analysis, basically, of how the girls' bodies were processed and the tools he used to cut them apart, basically. And so it was basically physical evidence analysis and then testimony as to whether one or multiple killers did this.
Well, and your conclusion was?
My conclusion was it was absolutely one individual who had a considerable amount of experience in terms of butchering, etc.
Right. I mean, I don't know if you feel comfortable sharing, but how do you feel about the sort of idea of he got convicted on some of them, but not the others, and there's some pressure to continue this case?
Personally, I'm thrilled that we're not going ahead. I realize there's some loss there for families in terms of a sense of justice, but this was so expensive and so difficult to do. I'm not sure how we could pull it off. The more time goes by, the more investigators retire, the more we forget the minutiae of what we were involved with the investigation, and the more civilian witnesses die as well. So it becomes harder and harder. I think it's not going to, another trial would not impact his sentencing one bit. So
right.
I think it's the
it's
pragmatic.
It's just closure for families.
It's closure, but I think under these circumstances it's pragmatic to say, no, we won't go ahead, but share the information with the family so they know where their loved ones went.
Right. Well, you know, I'm just listening to you the last 10 minutes or so talking about what you, I mean, just even witnessing that video that you described and going to these rape rooms and then kind of delving into the Pickton case. You really do, I think, more than most police and investigators that I've ever met, deal with the darkest sides of humanity. I mean, how do you deal with that? How do you sleep? How do you, like, after seeing that video that you described, I mean, does it flash back in your mind? How do you cope with that?
Absolutely. These are difficult images. I had never seen child sex assault videos before. I've subsequently seen many of them. I think one of the things that really helps is the fact that I'm part of the solution. I have the privilege now of knowing many of the victims in Cambodia. We run rehabilitation centers. I know these girls as they grow up into beautiful young women and their lives are put together again, so there's hope. Mm-hmm. I'm not just passively watching this horrendous stuff. I'm engaging in it for hope and for healing. The other thing that's absolutely key for me is just my own faith. I mean, I think you need to rely on a higher power in order to survive some of this stuff if you do it for any length of time. And certainly my whole drive to help these kids is basically a spiritual drive, recognizing that they are valuable before God. They are not throwaway children. Some of these kids are sold for $20. Right. They're worth nothing in the world's eyes.
Yeah, you hear their families actually literally sell their kids to...
Absolutely. And I am absolutely convinced that they are of value. They have intrinsic value as human beings before God, and so that drives me ahead. And I've had psychologists tell me I should be suffering from post-traumatic stress. I don't. I believe that's a faith issue, and I believe it's also because I get to see the results of successful rescues and rehabilitation.
Well, I want to talk about the Ratanak Foundation, but did you leave the RCMP partly because you wanted to be more on the solution side rather than the enforcement side?
I think the reason I really left the RCMP was a health issue, because I was working at that time 2 jobs. One was a volunteer job running the Ratanak Foundation. The other was full-time RCMP. And those 2 were killing me, literally, slowly. And it really became apparent that I would have to focus on what was most on my heart. And other people can do RCMP work and the kind of forensic science I was doing. Other people would love to get those jobs, whereas very few people were in a position to do what I was doing in Cambodia. And it just became clear, the more I engaged, particularly with these little girls, when it was no longer a statistical model for child sex trade. Mm-hmm. Now they were real children. Now I was looking at faces, big brown eyes looking up at me. That's life-changing, and it just became an imperative for me to go and deal with this. And I've been thrilled to be able to devote my life to where my heart is, and that's with these children.
Let's take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll talk more about how this whole foundation started and what exactly you guys do in Cambodia. More with Brian McConaghy after this short break. I'm back with Brian McConaghy, the founding director of the Ratanak Foundation. So tell me what this foundation does, and where does that title come from in the first place?
Ratanak was the name of a little girl, a little baby girl who died in 1989 because there was no medicine allowed through the UN embargo to help her. And even though I was in the RCMP, I decided to do something very politically incorrect and smuggle medication into what was considered an enemy state then to prevent such needless deaths. And so I never really planned a charity per se. I was just passionate about these children, and it didn't cost me my career. The RCMP were tolerant of it, amazingly.
And they let you continue doing this while you were in the RCMP?
Yes, I did it for 18 years in the RCMP. So it started off with medical supplies being delivered, and then as the Civil War progressed, we ended up getting more established and building clinics, then building hospitals. After the Civil War and the UN involvement, we got involved with orphanages after the AIDS crisis, AIDS home care programs, all the sort of health care stuff, as well as developing a hospital with a full operating capability out in the minefields in the northwest, because Cambodia, as well as having many other issues, it's one of the most landmined countries in the world, so we're dealing with that issue. And then it all kind of went sideways for me when I first saw these videos of children being raped.
So you started this work before you even got into this child sex?
Oh yes, that's why I was called into the original files, because I knew Cambodia well, and there's very few law enforcement people in Canada who knew Cambodia.
Right. So now, is Ratanak's main work on child sex exploitation?
We've been able to maintain all other programs, medical, orphanage, healthcare, whatever, but the centerpiece right now, because of my skill set, knowing both charity work and policing, the centerpiece for us is the child exploitation stuff.
And this foundation is funded by donations?
Absolutely, just regular donations from Canadians. The vast majority of the funding comes from regular donations that see what we do and want to engage. It's very grassroots in that way.
Oh. So you have a rehab center for some of these girls,
yes,
right?
Yes.
What exactly do you do there?
We run several programs, foster care programs, etc., for some of the victims of the pedophiles we've been talking about. We also have a rehabilitation center that currently has 59 girls in it. There is a boys program as well. It's just started that I could spend another whole hour talking about boys issues, but the particular
because
center...
there are boys who are exploited as well.
Absolutely, absolutely, horribly exploited, and they're very difficult to work with because of how they've been exploited and how they've been traumatized. But the girls program, we currently have 59 girls in the center. We have 61 staff to deal with their issues. It's 24/7, full-on counseling, therapy, medical intervention. It takes years.
With therapy, you actually have psychologists who...
Yes, a Canadian Khmer psychologist trained them, and it's all done in their native language. The girls are either ethnic Vietnamese or ethnic Khmer, which is Cambodian, and they're counseled by the same ethnicity as themselves. We can keep it as normalized as possible in terms of an environment. The center is high security. It's in a secret location because many of these children are witnesses in international pedophile trials, and if they could be done...
trials that are actually going to court?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of these children have testified in the U.S. There's other opportunities to testify elsewhere in the world that are sort of brewing right now. So these children are at some risk because they're key witnesses. And so they have to be protected. So there's a huge child protection component to this as well as rehabilitation.
Do you try to reunite them with their families?
Wherever possible, yes, that's the ideal. But obviously we have to do an awful lot of groundwork to establish that that family is safe, that that family didn't sell them. If the family had the child kidnapped or they were tricked out of their daughter by some guy who said, I've got a wonderful restaurant job for your daughter that will get you out of poverty, and they buy it and lose their daughter, then absolutely, if we do the groundwork and can demonstrate the family's safe, we'll repatriate wherever possible, even into Vietnam, back to the families. Normally that's not the case. Normally the families have knowingly sold them and the children would be going back to a high-risk situation, in which case, after the rehabilitation center, years of rehab, we get into job skill training and rebuilding a life so that that individual life is viable in society in and of themselves.
And you have some success already?
Absolutely. The programs that are post rehab center are very high-end programs. We found that most people want to, for the sake of cost, train a girl just to get back on her feet, maybe sell vegetables at a market.
But I mean, you have girls who were in the child sex industry who are actually living kind of normal lives.
Absolutely. They're still in transition. They will be for a while, but they have jobs. We have one cafe where these children that were nothing in society, that were considered product and subhuman, are now making cakes for the Cambodian king, the best cakes in the country.
Wow. Well, you described Cambodia in some ways as a really war-torn, morally devoid country, but there does seem to be some effort now. Comrade Doik, the prison guard who killed tens of thousands, I think,
yes,
was sentenced to 35 years?
Yes, just recently.
Just recently. I mean, do you feel like it's coming to terms with its legacy now? Is this a good thing that these Khmer trials are going on?
Absolutely. I mean, they're expensive, and there's always debate in a developing country how much money you spend, and it costs many millions to do that trial. I think there is a need for some measure of closure, though, because no one's been held to account for what is the most radical communist revolution with the most efficient killing machine in the 20th century, proportionally to a society.
Which had some... The U.S. had a role in what happened there.
Tragically, a massive role in bombing this neutral country at the time, which was the most extensive conventional bombing campaign the world has seen on a neutral country. So it's devastating, and that society is still recovering, psychologically, ethically, morally, institutionally, every way it's still recovering, which I think is what really makes this pedophile activity so despicable, is because they are seeking out the most vulnerable. They are seeking out a country that cannot defend itself, that is absolutely traumatized.
Well, so what's next for you? I mean, is this what you're going to continue working on?
Well, I never really planned Ratanak Foundation as a charity to begin with, so I'm really not sure
but this is your
long-term plans. Absolutely. My goal is to help as many Cambodians as I can. My goal is to be a friend of the Cambodian people. They have had many individuals nationally and internationally who say they're friends and have devastated the country. And I think there's a role for people to step up to the plate and say, no, we will actually serve the Cambodian people.
And you feel like Cambodia is sort of moving in the right direction?
Absolutely. Although it's still considered a very unstable government by international standards, it's the most...
Canada has closed its embassy?
That's right. We've closed our embassy just on economic reasons, not because of any particular problem with the Cambodian government, but we have kind of opted out, which is a real shame diplomatically. But Cambodia is moving ahead, and while it's tragic and by our standards unstable, it's the most stable it's been in anybody's lifetime there. And there's a sense of hope developing.
Well, good luck with your work. Thanks for joining us. You can visit the Ratanak Foundation online at ratanak.org. If you have a question or comment about my interview with Brian McConaghy, send us an email. The address is info@thestandardtv.ca. Coming up next, a Canadian reporter who has just recently returned from Iraq. Her story after this break.